In this video, we're going to talk about the TRE model, which stands for thesis, reasons, and evidence. And we're also going to talk about how to find a thesis and distinguish between reasons and evidence. So this is kind of a framework for understanding something that you read, and you'll get chances to practice this in this class. So this is important for A1. Your A1 assignment involves identifying the thesis and writing a key point summary. And so to do that, in addition to the thesis, you're going to be identifying key points are kind of analogous here to reasons. So you find the main things that back up the thesis. So they're not just random facts or points from the article, they're things that back up the thesis, which is the main claim. So when you think about a thesis, you're thinking about the central argument that the author is making in the text. So I give you an article, you try to figure out what the main argument is, then you identify reasons or key points that back up the thesis. So if the reason is true, then the thesis is true. The example I always like to use is that the thesis is that donuts are the best breakfast food for busy college students. So that's a claim. For busy college students, donuts are the best breakfast food. And then you have reasons that they're, let's say, cheap, convenient, and available. So that's not just random information. They're the best breakfast food. Why? Because they're cheap. Why? Because they're convenient. Why? Because they're available. And so those are reasons that the thesis is true. That's what you're trying to find when you're using the TRE method. But then, you might say they're the best breakfast food because they're cheap. And your reader might say, how do I know they're really cheap? And so then you'd want to provide evidence. You'd want to say, well, if you go to King Soopers, you can get them for 50 cents, and that's cheap. And so that would be a piece of evidence. So the evidence helps to prove the reasons back up the thesis. So it's all connected. So there's usually several pieces of evidence for each reason. That might not always be true, but it's often true. Again, here, I'm not going to stay on this slide, but if you're having trouble, if I'm going a little bit too fast, feel free to pause, take a look at these definitions before we move on. So it's nice to have that system. That structure can help organize in your mind how a text works and help you make sense of it, but you still have to be able to figure out what the thesis is. And students are often telling me that that's really hard to do, and it's a big part of your A1. I assign you your articles, you read through them, and you're trying to figure out what the thesis is. And so here's a strategy for you. A thesis can be stated or implied. Stated means that it actually shows up in the text. So the author writes their thesis. They make a claim, you could take that sentence, and that is the claim. But sometimes it's implied, which means that they're making a central argument, but they never say it in like a sentence. It's just having read the article, you can kind of figure it out. But that can be really tricky. So what you should do, and I know you're not going to do this for every text that you interact with, and that's totally fine, because for many of them, it won't be necessary. But for A1 here, and for some other texts that I assign in this course, it probably will be necessary. So what you should do is read through the text. And so for A1, you have some options. You should read each one and take a guess at what the thesis is. So that could be you pick out a sentence that you think this is probably the central argument, or if it's implied, then you got to guess. You say, I don't think any of these sentences are the thesis, but here's what I think the thesis is, and write that down. Then read through the article again. So now you have your thesis that you guessed, keep that in your mind, and read the article and see, do the things in the article back up the thesis? Does it feel like it was all written to prove that one sentence? If so, that's probably the correct thesis. If not, let's say it's kind of like that, but there's a whole tangent. It talks about a totally different thing for a while, and that's not in your thesis at all. You've got to adjust your thesis a little bit. And so you can tinker that way. Adjust the thesis, read back through, try to figure out, okay, now is it all supporting the thesis? And if not, make another adjustment. That's a lot of work. And so that's not a thing you're going to do with every text, but with your A1, it's a big part of the semester, and a main part of that project is figuring out what the thesis is and what the reasons are that are backing up that thesis. So try that method if you're having trouble figuring out the thesis. For reasons and evidence, like I said before, it's, a difference in scope, and then you should think about what's proving what. Find reasons, those are generally bigger things that are supporting the thesis. Smaller things that are proving the reason, those will be evidence. So this is a new thing I want you to try when you get an article. Think about TRE. Think about what the core argument is. What are the reasons backing it up? What are the pieces of evidence proving those reasons?